name's Glyn Pooley and I'd like to talk about art. This time my subject is which you can see this beautiful interior, and their art and their life was totally interwoven. You can see that their paintings are on the walls. They actually painted parts of the walls. The whole environment they created was vibrant, could say kind of uplifting, maybe at times rather intense, but all playing a deep part in their aesthetic approach to art and life. See in this other picture gives you an insight into the really upper middle class lifestyle that they were living. A number of them went to Cambridge and met at Cambridge. They had quite academic education, and their families were quite high-ranking people in the community. Had a certain level of freedom, intellectual freedom in the development of their thoughts, as well as aesthetic and creative freedom. They were financially independent and elements like that. Intellectualism was high on their list of priorities in the creation of their work, particularly with the writers and economists, but obviously tonight focus on the artists in the group. But you can see here that they've painted on the fireplace, above the walls, rooms, and as part of the group, the Bloomsbury group, they also set up a publishing group for the writers, an artist workshop that made arts and crafts called the Amiga Group, which was a commercial distribution of the arts and crafts that they created. Just looking around the room gives you a kind of understanding of the environment. This was around about 1909, 10 or so years, peaked about 1920. So it was just before the First World War. First World War brought quite a few issues and intellectual problems, how they had to kind of work through. A number of them were pacifists and conscientious objectors. And then after the First World War, how they manifest their artworks to have relevance to the contemporary society was all again drawn into question. So all these things come out through the artworks. Interesting that they've got a Buddha, an Indian kind of statue above the mantelpiece there, in the heart of England at that particular time in the intellectual community. So let's have a look at one of the artists, Duncan Grant. You can see, straight away the influences on the immediacy of the environment. In terms of the environment just being the inside of their house, in this case, the farmhouse. Duncan Grant was born in 1885. I think he lived to the 1970s, 5 or 6, something like that. Traditional art education, again, from, as I said, higher upper middle class. But he was influenced by, I suppose, the post-impressionists. A number of the artists were. You see parts of late Monet in this, and the slight looseness of the brushwork was also, you look at Edvard Manet's work, we've looked at, and that's in evidence here. The construction of the picture, very well thought out, and there's a nice balance between the composition and the light in the spaces. It's great to look at these kind of works in this way, so we understand and reinforce how they're put together. The language of painting and the language of composition is very much in evidence there. As I keep saying to us, draw us to the middle first, in this case, so that we end up going round and round. Then that with the colour red, so the area which our eye is attracted to, is hints of greenish greys above it, which is just complementary, and then we kind of have ways of stretching out and round the rest of the picture through the strong constructional lines which hold the whole piece together. But there's a kind of realism to it, and in terms of it is a portrayal of an element of the artist's study there. We can identify the elements of chairs and curtains and things like that, but there's a freedom, an element of freedom of expression. So there's a balance between a conservatism, if you like, with an element of freedom, which is what the Bloomsbury Group is all about, really. And interesting in terms of subject matter, anything that is possible to make a painting. We see this with, they've taken post-impressionist Van Gogh, his chair or his shoes or his boots or something in his very simple room. In this case, Duncan Rand's taken the bedside lamp, but he's kind of imbued it with these radiant colours that were engaging with slightly later painters. We looked at the Fauvism group a few weeks ago, and they were aware of their kind of artistic movement in France. So they start to add those kinds of stronger colours with the use of the more expressionist use of marks. But again, a lovely use of light, composition and structure, but gives us an insight into the kind of life that they lived. Obviously, a lot of reading was going on there, and some beautiful decorative oriental kind of colours and drapes surrounding their environment. So really looking and creating the most, in their opinion, aesthetic, beautiful environment they could offer to work amongst. And this is a lovely piece in 1915, painted during the war. That's a dichotomy. Interesting. A lot of things going on in the country at that particular time. Incredible amount of struggle, suffering, etc. This group shuts itself away and intellectualizes about the quality and the values and the importance of the pursuit of the arts to its aesthetic, to aesthetic heights. They also engage with the idea of interpersonal love and the boundaries of that, and moving beyond boundaries of that. Possibility of the individual's ability to self-realize what became a quite secluded little environment. But they often try to then translate and give some of those ideas and concepts of beauty and understanding and take them out into the community in other ways, through the writing and through some of the other members of the group, economists, etc. But looking at the artwork here, this is a lovely piece, isn't it? It's like a little musical melody in purples and reds. The construction is lovely. What is nice to notice is that the way the pieces be put together, the boundaries between the objects are kind of blurred. For example, the light at the edge of this bottle is revealed by the tone of the darker tone in this jar, this glazed picture, and that is almost like the sort of thing that we see with Giorgio Morandi when we looked at his little still lives of bottles and simple objects in his studio, although the choice of objects is a little bit more elaborate. And one could argue decadent sometimes in some of these artworks. But the Bloomsbury Group were about that as well. It was pursuing love, pursuing all kinds of activities that were bordering on hedonistic, I suppose we could say, trying to put it politely. So they appreciate the beauty in expensive objects. They appreciate the beauty in exotic objects, but then they try to share that and put that out into their environment and community. This is a picture of the artist's daughter, Duncan Grant. Fascinating. This is slightly later. Obviously, intellectual pursuit was at the forefront of the Bloomsbury Group. This was his daughter with one of the other artists in the group, Vanessa Bell. Although Duncan Grant was gay, he had a number of relationships with other male members of the group, as did Vanessa Bell. They were very interconnected, and you could say forerunners to the free love of the 1960s. It was all going on in that farmhouse, and this kind of isolated them, or they challenged society. They challenged the the conservative view of 1910, 1920s England at that time, about how the greater community could kind of operate. And, it's interesting how relatively now, from our eyes, their art has become, quite conservative. But we can't escape the aesthetic beauty in it. And that's the element to kind of focus on. So it's a lovely touching image of the artist's daughter just sat in the chair reading, and it's reflective. There's signifiers of other interests that the artists have, and the composition again is, beautifully put together. We can just roll around it till our heart's content, moved by the brush marks, by the decoration, by the different details in the objects, and we get an insight into the thought processes and the life of the people being portrayed, as we do in this one with a girl at the piano again. It's like stepping into a bygone age 100 years ago, but there's also a twist of modernity about it. These were modernists in their outlook, from the perspective where, this is, I suppose it's modernist, but it's English modernism, which is quite a bit behind continental modernism on lots of levels. Although, they show an interest in developing color and developing how insight can be portrayed, there's still a real big step or influence in what the eye can see and in the environment they're trying to portray. It's not like, say, for example, Kandinsky or Mondrian, where they're purely intellectual and abstract. They don't step into that realm with their works. They keep one foot firmly planted in what the eye can see, if you like. So we've got a beautiful image of a girl sat playing the piano, some lovely muted colors, again an insight into the interior of the world, with a little bit of space out through the window. Sometimes the images inside the farmhouse, they look almost kind of claustrophobic. There's a density to it, and anyone that's read any works by Virginia Woolf will probably feel the same when they read her works. There's so much detail, and there's very little space between the stream of consciousness narrative that she kind of portrays, and that's what you get in some of these images by Duncan Grant and Vanessa Bell. This one by Vanessa Bell, if you like, has got a bit more light to it. Light has become a little bit more of the feature, and so she's managed to create a bit more space. It's interesting how she's edited down the information in painterly terms just to put these essentials in. And it's important to think that these are constructs when we look at this. So it's what you leave out is important to what you share with the viewer. So look at the beautiful way she's portrayed Duncan Grant. Just a few tones, shaped for the light part of the face and then the dark part. It's given us an insight into the simplicity of just painting using the easel as a painting wood chair, just keeping it rustic, if you like, a touch on the rustic quality, even though these were high intellectuals. Going through the doorway to another room of which is lit, there's an element of optimism in that. There's often a contrast. There's an element of optimism in a picture like this, whereas sometimes their own lives were quite tragic, or they became quite tragic. Vanessa Bell here was a slightly later one, so her work kind of developed. You can see the colours of post-impressionism are there. There's a kind of uplift there, but now she's kind of involved with the geometric quality of the patternation. The element of design becomes more important. They did as I said, developed this whole group, a studio that put their designs and their artworks out to a design house, which they created themselves, that went out into public. Although most of the objects they made were really quite handmade, hand finished, and therefore quite expensive. But it's interesting to see how their artwork then links into the arts and crafts movement. Something that maybe we saw with people like William Morris in the 1850s, 60s, 70s. But let's look at the colours and the structure again here. Things have been flattened off a lot more in this, but again we're led around the whole surface of the picture. Simple little object, but beautifully coloured, beautiful composition. As in this one, the conservatism in terms of it's just a vase with some flowers in it, but there's the indication of the design quality there in the background. It's loose treatment of the marks, characteristics of it, darks and lights, how we can just light up a corner of the room. What we focus on in our own environment, that's what maybe looking at Bloomsbury does, because everything is contained within a relatively small space with a lot of their artworks within the rooms of the farmhouse. What we've gone through in recent times, we've become more and more familiar with the interior of our living rooms, etc. Can be, a focus, and we can look more intently of what we've got around us. What intrinsic beauty they have in their own kind of rights. Yes, it might be a vase with flowers in, there's beauty in that, but you might find something else that is you can focus on, that's got a certain specific intrigue for you. And there's many objects of interest just when you look around your room that could be made into paintings. So what we're looking for is that focus of interest to choose from, and then the relationship of that focus of interest with the inhabitants that live in that environment. As you can see here, a number of the focus objects, of course, are self-evident. Chairs, draperies, bins and things like that, waste paper baskets and papers. But then the relationship of their lives and gives you an insight into the kind of environment they lived in. The housemaid there. We could always do with a housemaid, couldn't we? Maybe, or something like that, to enable the running of their lives to kind of run smoothly. But you can see the combination of the interior life, the environment, their focus again, colours, the use of the composition, the lovely light they managed to get into the picture, and the structure is lovely as well. This light part here with a bit of red in it draws us to the centre, and it reflects the light on the coming through the window there. Easier said and easier to look at than it is to actually achieve something like this, because you've got to make sure you've got a really good composition, got to be very clear about where your light source is. And you can see although there's form being created, light and dark, there's certain elements of moulding going on between the light and dark. There's not that high finish that you get maybe in the classical masters pieces, because they're not interested in that. They're interested in another level of freedom in the brush marks and the brush strokes. And hence this is another one, just flowers, but also the mirror, the tiles that are reflecting in the mirror. You can see it's a mirror by the rose being reflected in there. This interest in the Oriental. This could be in Morocco or something like that, North Africa mirror. And when we place one object next to another, it can reflect different cultures, but it also tells us a lot about ourselves and our own interests in our lives. A number of us probably been away, if we're fortunate, to different places in the world, and we brought back mementos, and then we fill our house with these, and they tell us of our interests and our experiences. They create a kind of documentary residue of the experience of life for us, and this is what these artists were kind of portraying, really. What you create in your environment feeds back into your art, and vice versa. What you think about feeds out into your environment. And that's never more evident than in your close locale. So, for example, in your house or your flat or wherever you particularly spend a lot of your time, there's always that interaction. And I remember a friend of mine, one of the ladies I made a picture of in between the lines, actually, and that's people make places and places make people. And when you just take that line and refer it to the Bloomsbury Group, particularly with their interiors, it says a lot. You know, it kind of sums up a lot about their ideas, about their concepts, about how they relate to the world, their pursuit of aesthetic interest, and how that then feeds back into the lives that they lead. And here she's focused on just a bowl of plums, an oil painting, as you can see, richly painted, deep expressionist marks. This could have been painted by Edvard Manet or someone like that, or even going back further, looking at it, almost like by people like Courbet, who were, you know, realist painters in mid 19th century France, though the colours are a little bit brighter. So they always had a nod back to the last century, but then they were trying to give it a slight modern twist, and I think that shows in this one. You know, the design quality has become much more prominent. They've taken on certain elements of Cézanne and people like that in terms of the portrayal of the apples, but kept one foot in the realist world, but then emphasized the design quality, which, you know, is not dissimilar to art deco that kind of just starts to appear during this period, well, particularly 1920s and 30s as well. So they're kind of their time, in their place, but also when you create an environment or an experience, you bring things from the past, you bring your interests from the past in there, you bring things from the present and your interests of the present, and you have aspirations towards the future, and you create objects that you hope, think, and will have an impact on the future as well. So all those things come together, they coalesce in your environment. You'll see it often by photographs that people put up of their ancestors or their children for the future and their grandchildren, and photographs of people from their past. They're all telling this kind of story, and the objects you place around you do the same kind of thing. It becomes really striking when it's kind of condensed into a small interior with a number of people living in it. In this case, here with a bowl of figs, again, combination of the contemporary designs which they used for you'll see what they call the Amiga design studio. These were things that they actually made and sold, and then you have the simple kind of still life. I think it was interesting that they, as well as making their art objects, they kind of set up organizations, although very small and could say quite elite, but they were organizations that would enable them then to sell and promote their artwork and put them out there. So design studios, or in terms of the writers, they set up Bloomsbury Press, which then published the works of Virginia Woolf and the like. But then they've gone on, you know, and they've published many authors after. Some of the biggest names authors in the country have been through Bloomsbury Press. So they've got a certain kind of impact, which is really far-reaching as well. But this is part of its origins. I suppose, you know, we could, you know, Virginia Woolf is a good example of a writer that's, you know, seen as one of the greatest writers of that particular period. And it's interesting the relationship between her and Vanessa Bell, and people that inhabit your space have an influence on you, of course, and they kind of reflect not just the life that you're going to live, but the kind of things that you produce and create in your world as well. So it is always important to think about the environment that we have around us and the people we have within our environment, or don't have in some cases, and then see how that has an interactive quality on the artworks that we'd like to create. You know, you might want to make an artwork of one of your relatives that sat in a chair, you know, for a certain reason, or it might be a young person that you know, can visit or lives with you. You might want to make a portrait of them. And it's the interaction in the environment that you both live in, or you both spend some time in, is what is then portrayed. This is the interest, as I said, that Vanessa Bell had in the Oriental, the Turkish box. You know, there was something exotic, I suppose, about these kinds of things in the early 20th century, relatively rural England where they settled. And it's also exotic in terms of the lifestyle that they were living, the interrelationships they were having, and all that was kind of coalescing in their artworks. The colour, the joie de vivre, if you like, the joy of life coming through, and trying to portray elements of that. So how you think often will be an indication of how you paint. We are all that we think, so whatever things we're focusing on at any particular time will have an influence on what we create, and that's what comes through in these artworks. This is another good example. This is one of the other artists in the group, Roger Fry, who was also a very famous art critic that particularly championed modernism, post-impressionism, although he was known for his writings on classical artworks and Renaissance paintings. Here he's got him sat in the Matisse room, probably the Royal Academy. Matisse obviously had made a massive impact at this time as a Fauvist artist, exhibiting in London, emphasis on colour and shape and form, and appreciation of the construction of a painting rather than on the narrative, you know, that was much more important in previous generations. And then he sat there with an image of himself studying and kind of reflecting on those kinds of qualities. Matisse's red room, we looked at, his red studio. Then imbuing that in the artist's own work. So it's making a stance for modernism at that particular time and place, as we see in this one, with it really looks modern but conservative. There's modern in the design, almost conservative is Cézanne kind of quality in the colours and the elements of kind of construction. This kind of line that they trod basically became, I suppose, in lots of ways, the undoing of the group as it kind of went on, because they lived a very decadent life, ivory tower, if you like. So there was going to be, you know, fractions and relative limitations to that, which were going to be questioned later on as time passed. But taking the artworks as they stand, you know, we can really appreciate the beauty in it because the aesthetic quality is there. Interesting how this is just, you know, a bowl of fruit placed on this lovely top of this dresser. The diagonal movement of it is being contained by the triangles all around it to enable us to kind of focus on the center part of the image again. So the construction's really good. The use of the colors running through it all work well. And we can see that we don't negate any part of the picture. I wish sometimes when I'm looking at paintings there was no word background, because background almost, you think of background and think of something more subordinate to the foreground. It's not. It's an integral part of any painting. We don't want to be thinking in terms of separation in a picture. Everything is interconnected, everything is interdependent, and that's what you see flowing through this work. This is an insight into the modernist kind of style as well, where they've taken on, he's looking at complementary colours, but design qualities, paring things down almost to flat areas, but looking at different textures there, textures of the curtain, textures of glass, or whether it be clay, but a very simple background. But there's beautiful colours, there's an element of mutedness in the use of the colours, use of the complementaries, and above all, really lovely use of space, so that we got a place to be silent and reflective and concentrate on the objects as well. And just some subtle outlines of design pass through the background there. And you can see how the paintings, that we just saw then gets translated into the furniture that the Omega workshops make. They operated between 1913, I think it is 1919, and they made these handcrafted, hand-built, beautiful domestic objects. The artists in the group and the writers in Bloomsbury, they wanted to blur the line between the fine arts and the crafts movement, as William Morris had. They just said it's an integral part of creation. It's an integral part of life. Often, when we think about even the rooms we live in, we don't, by instinct in Britain, most of us paint on our walls. We put wallpaper on them, things like this. And we go and buy that. So it's someone else's choice. Then we're linking to it, and then we're putting it on our walls rather than directly painting on them themselves. Some of us do, of course, and have great fun creating all kinds of things all over our rooms, whether we use stencils or whether we paint directly on it. And I think early on we were talking about children's immediacy with their environment. They're going to paint on a wall unless their parents or guardians tell them not to. And it's that kind of quality then that you kind of link it all up. Your environment becomes you become your environment. But with the English moderation and temperament towards, in this case, an element of conservatism, but business, you can see how their free-thinking ideas get pared down into almost like a business model that can then go out and be shared with a certain section of the community. These were expensive handmade objects. Only certain people could partake in it. Roger Fry was talking about the interconnectedness of the environment and the artistic world. It was for a relatively limited few, but you can go beyond that. You can go and paint your back of your door. You can go and paint a panel in the kitchen of a drawer that's fallen apart or anything like that. The chances are, you have that freedom to kind of do it with an element of Bloomsbury aesthetic. This is interesting. These are some of the kinds of things that they made in the Omega workshop. These will be wooden flowers. They were used for decorative purposes, and Roger Fry's made a painting of the wooden flowers in the jar there, and made a constructed painting. Lovely colours, lovely construction. Again, what we call a modernist kind of look to elements, flattening of planes, element of decoration, and space again to focus on the main objects in the piece. Study for Roger Fry. It's nice to see these studies sometimes, to see how they maybe started their paintings and explored the figure that they wanted to make a painting of, just on an off-colour buff bit of board, or in this case it looks as if it could even be a bit of plasterboard that was going to be painted, that's actually painted on the wall. The direct method that Roger Fry was using there to capture a picture of Vanessa Bell, and the direct method was translated to his portrait picture here of Virginia Woolf, writer, of course. I guess a really kind of interesting look on her face, contemplative, but muted colours again. It almost looks like a fresco image that you would find in the Italian chapel, in terms of the colours and the way the paint's been applied. So design is very important. Structure, these internal spaces, these little triangles within spaces there, just to kind of give a strength and a solidity to the image. And the whole thing is based on whole image is based on a triangle as well, which is something solid. Also conceptually deals with time, space, and insight as well. Fascinating. And this is a lovely little portrait of the artist Winifred Gill. She worked at the Omega workshops with Roger Fry for a number of years. I think she ran it as well. And a number of these artists that were in this group, they were from Quaker families, so they had social consciences, and they set up a number of kind of humanitarian projects after Bloomsbury to try and bring rich and poorer people together and to share resources. It was all done in quite a conservative way, but they did have an influence, and a number of organisations and projects and charities have manifest from it. But looking at this picture, it's interesting. This lovely simple, reflective, contemplative image of the sitter is just reflected in the water. It's interesting to know what artists have to do in terms of the construction of their picture, because when you think of the water, you'd think it would just be mirroring what's above, but when you really analyze it, you see that it's not. You see how colors have been simplified and muted and at times darkened. Look at this area. You see this dark arch doesn't really reflect what's going on up there. If you look at the line across the top of the reflection, it's not there. You know, it would be somewhere up there on that side. So it's not a mirroring, it's a construction. As long as it works, you know. The main element to give the impression of it mirroring is at the start here, this reflected element up there, and the darkening and the muted tones in the water. But there's a lovely strength of design and composition running up through the picture, across there, up there, with relaxation in the chair. After you've had a nice little rest, you can come and read your book and contemplate the higher aesthetics of existence, all brought together in a lovely little picture of Winifred Gill.
If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell notification.